So, the second half of chapter 22. We're going to be continuing on with some functional stuff. So, at the end of the first half, we were talking about mechanisms of ventilation and everything, very important, of course. We're going to start the second half here by talking about some different measurements that you can take of ventilation. We'll be doing this in lab this week too. So the process of measuring inspired and expired air is called spirometry. And as I said, we'll get to do that in lab this week. You're taking the lab test today, so this will be on Thursday, but we'll be measuring that. When we do spirometry, we measure different volumes, which you see up here on the board now, as well as capacities, which are combinations of two or more of these. Now for it to be spirometry, what you're really measuring is air flowing into or out of the mouth, so there are certain limitations, but we can infer a lot about the function of the respiratory system with this process. Well, look at this chart here. It's some different values, normal values for the various volumes that we saw on the previous page. Now, the first one I want to draw your attention to is tidal volume. So notice this is tidal volume, T-I-D-A-L, not tidal volume, T-I-T-L-E. This word tidal here is referring to the tides, right? And the tides, what do? They move in and out slowly and predictably. And when you're at rest, you're breathing that way too. The air moves in and out in a predictable and consistent manner. Okay? So if I were to attach a spirometry device to you as you're just sitting there in your chair, the breaths that I would be measuring, they would be tidal volume. And if we look at our chart, we see normal tidal volume levels for both male and female are about 500 milliliters, which is not very much. Half a liter is maybe about as much as is in your water bottle right there. Right? So that's about how much air you're breathing in and out at rest. The reason why it's not very much is because at rest, when your body's not really doing much, it doesn't really demand much oxygen either, right? Because you don't need to generate excess energy or eliminate excess carbon dioxide, that kind of thing. Now, by and large, I'm not going to make you remember the values, but I do want you to know the one for tidal volume, okay? Because it's important and because it's the same for males and females. Let's talk about what these other measurements mean. So we know what tidal volume is. When you're breathing like you are now at rest, not very much. Could you breathe in more air if you really tried? Sure. So that extra amount you could breathe in with effort is called inspiratory reserve volume. This is extra, so this is on top of tidal volume, not including tidal volume. And it's the extra amount of air that you could breathe in, again, with effort, on top of the tidal volume. Also, as you're sitting there at rest, not really doing anything, just breathing your tidal volume, could you blow out more air if you wanted to? Sure. So we also have an expiratory reserve volume. The extra amount of air you could force out with effort. Because remember, what is driving your expiration there during tidal volume? What's making that happen? In terms of mechanisms. Just sitting there, tidal volume, no real effort. You breathe in because the diaphragm contracts. You breathe out because of elastic recoil. But, like we saw, there are accessory muscles of expiration, so you could use them if you wanted to blow out more air, and that's the expiratory reserve volume. And then finally, there's the residual volume. Does anyone know what residual volume is? Residual volume is the amount of air that you can't force out no matter how hard you tried. So there's always some air left in your lungs. Your body doesn't let you breathe it all out. Because what would happen if you literally got all the air out?
Lung collapse?
Your lungs would be collapsed. And is that good or bad?
That might be bad.
Yeah, that's a bad one. So we keep this residual volume, air that's always in the lungs. Again, you don't have to memorize these numbers. I just want to point out something. Notice, the tidal volume was the same for males and females, for average adult males and females. But then when you start to get to the other ones, we see a pretty significant difference, right? Inspiratory reserve volume, the extra you can breathe in with effort, 3,100 milliliters for males, 1,900 milliliters for females. So that's like a 40% difference, right? Expiratory reserve, 1,200 for males, 700 for females. Residual, not that much difference because this is not a functional amount, so it's just 1,200 to 1,100. Why is there such a big difference in inspiratory and expiratory reserve, or really just lung size in general, between males and females?
Does that have to do with body size?
So body size is a big part of it. We talked about this with total blood volume too, right? Males on average larger than females, so most of our organs would be bigger too, and that would include the lungs. But besides just being bigger, males tend to be built in a different shape than females, right? Wider at the top, narrower. So we proportionally have larger chest cavities, which allows for larger lungs, and that's why you see those differences. That being said, there's a lot of factors that influence this. For example, lung size can't really be changed very much with things like physical conditioning, but lung performance can. We talked about how age can affect compliance. So there is a lot of variation, and these numbers are not going to be 100% consistent for everybody. What is going on? Is someone on the roof?
It sounds like it.
Okay. Last summer when I tried to have class in this room, they were building that building over there, you know, and so there's construction every day. And one of the days was when they were building a little hallway or a little breezeway that connects the two buildings over here, you know. And so they were drilling into this wall right about where the corner of that room was, and it was so loud. It was they were using some kind of pneumatic drill and I think a jackhammer at one point, and so I was literally having to yell over the sound of the construction. But the best part was, you know, eventually he would stop doing that for a moment, but I never knew when that was coming, and then all of a sudden I'd just be shouting to a quiet room. All right, so like I said, you combine two or more volumes and you get a capacity. That's what these are. Not single measurements, but rather combinations of two or more volumes. So the first one up there is inspiratory capacity. Inspiratory capacity is the total amount of air you can breathe in. Right. So what volumes would we have to combine to get our inspiratory capacity?
Inspiratory reserve and tidal?
Right. The tidal volume, the normal amount of air you breathe in, plus the inspiratory reserve volume, the extra you could breathe in with effort. And that gives us our inspiratory capacity. The second one on there is functional residual capacity. Functional residual capacity is the amount of air left in your lungs after a normal tidal volume breath. So, what would you combine to get functional residual capacity? Which volumes?
Would it be residual and tidal?
Well, you got one of them, right? So there is residual volume. So this is the amount of air left in your lungs after a tidal volume breath is released. It's residual volume plus ERV, expiratory reserve volume. Vital capacity is the total amount of air that you can move. Everything you can breathe in and out with maximum effort. Basically your working range, right? It's going to be then everything except for residual volume. So what do we add together? Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, and expiratory reserve. Again, your whole working range, everything you can breathe in and out with maximum effort. And of course, total lung capacity is just all of those and residual volume too. But let me ask you something. With spirometry, which again is measuring the air as it comes into or out of your mouth, with spirometry, can you measure directly residual volume? No. Why?
How would you measure it? That's what I'm thinking.
Well, let's stick with this for a minute. So, residual volume, if that is by definition the amount of air you can't get out no matter what, you can't measure it with something that only detects airflow through your mouth, right? If I can't blow it out, how's it supposed to measure it?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is it can't. Okay. You would need to use other mechanisms if you were interested in finding out residual volume. So those are our capacities. Vital capacity probably being the most important, though we will look at inspiratory capacity as well. Here we've got a little diagram of a spirometry reading. So in this, when the line moves up, that's air coming in. When the line moves down, that's air going out. And on here, we see all of those different things labeled. So these small, slow breaths that you see in there, that is tidal volume. The amount of air you breathe in and out with each relaxed breath. But of course, as we said, you could definitely add to that with effort. So as the line goes up above tidal volume, that's the extra we could breathe in with effort. That is inspiratory reserve volume. So if you combine the normal amount you breathe in with the extra amount you could add to it, that gives us our inspiratory capacity. Like we said, this tidal volume wave is not the most you could breathe out either. You could force more air out with effort. That is expiratory reserve volume. And if you're looking at the total amount of air you can breathe in and out, your whole working range, that is your vital capacity. But of course, as we saw, there's always some air you can never get out. The line, notice, never goes all the way down to zero. So that is our residual volume. They are, in this recording, they're using numbers for the male average. All right, let's talk about some other factors in here that can affect this, or that are significant. There's something called the anatomic dead space. Anatomic dead space means the air that's in your respiratory system but not contributing to gas exchange. Basically, this is the air stuck in the conducting zone, right? So when you breathe in, you're trying to get that air into your alveoli and other parts of the respiratory zone, but some air remains in places like the trachea and the bronchi, right? It's not just like the vacuum of space in there. There's air in there. And of course, that air can't help anything. It can't contribute to gas exchange. That is our anatomic dead space. Notice an average for that is about 150 milliliters. A tidal volume breath is only about how much?
500.
Only about 500. Of the 500, 150, or about a third, is remaining in the anatomic dead space. I recently learned that dead space is also a term in architecture. It's like the unused space in the interior of a building that's going to like internal walls and where ventilation ducts pass through and stuff like that. That's the dead space in a building. It's unusable internal space. It's kind of the same thing in our respiratory system. It's not usable in the way that there's no gas exchange happening there. So this spirometer that we've been talking about, again, it measures air moving into or out of your mouth. And we're just going to kind of play around with it in lab to demonstrate tidal volume and vital capacity and all that. But this is also an instrument that can be used diagnostically to help determine various pulmonary disorders. Now they're talking about the difference here between obstructive and restrictive pulmonary diseases. They're saying that obstructive pulmonary diseases are diseases that increase resistance. Remember, we talked about that at the end of the last set of slides. What would be something that increases airway resistance? Makes it harder for air to flow through the airways.
Mucus?
It could, yeah. So if there's too much mucus in there, that could restrict air movement, which you could see with the example they've given, bronchitis, inflammation of the bronchi. We talked about asthma, right? That increases airway resistance too. As opposed to restrictive lung disorders, that those are ones that reduce compliance of the lungs. And they have pulmonary fibrosis up there too. And that was the example we gave. The lung is less distensible, less stretchy. Those would be restrictive disorders. Like I said, you can do diagnostic spirometry for that. We won't be doing that in lab. We're just going to be doing some demonstration. We're talking about non-respiratory air movements here. So most of the time, the purpose of our air movement is for respiration and normalizing blood gas levels. But of course, we can use it for other things too. Like, for example, some involuntary ones like coughing, sneezing, crying, hiccups, yawns. And then, of course, the big one that's not even on here is speech, right? You use air movement for the purposes of speech. I was at a conference in between spring and summer semesters, an anatomy and physiology conference, and I heard this really interesting talk, and it was about human evolution as it relates to long distance running. And it was really interesting. One of the things he said is that one of the reasons why humans were really successful early on, of course there's intelligence and there's speech and all of that, but one of the other things is that he said we were probably really good long distance runners, especially when it comes to hunting. And one of the reasons why is, unlike a lot of prey animals, our thermoregulatory mechanisms are independent of our breathing. In other words, how do animals like a dog, for example, cool off when they're hot?
Panting.
They pant. That's using their respiratory system. And of course, they can't do that while they're running and demanding more air. So in other words, when they need to cool off, any animal that pants, they have to stop. But we cool off by sweating. So in other words, our temperature regulation is independent of our respiration. And that's probably one of the things that allowed humans to dominate as hunters and predator animals. They're talking about the external and internal respiration here, which is gas exchange, either between the lungs and the bloodstream or between the bloodstream and the peripheral body tissues. This is diffusion of gas across a membrane, right? And that can be affected by several things. They're talking about the physical properties of the gas and the composition of the alveolar gas, which brings us to this idea of partial pressure. We talked about atmospheric pressure a little bit earlier, the total pressure in the air due to the weight of the atmosphere pushing down on you. Partial pressure means the portion of atmospheric pressure represented by a single gas. So air is not one single gas, it's a mixture, right? What's the main gas in the air around us? Biggest one?
Oxygen.
It's not oxygen, actually.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen. Nitrogen represents like 79% of the air around us. And so it therefore represents 79% of atmospheric pressure too. Or for example, oxygen is the next most abundant gas in the air, representing about 21% of the air around us. So let's see, what did we decide? We decided that 760 millimeters of mercury is the average atmospheric pressure at sea level. So if oxygen is 21% of the air, how do we find the partial pressure represented by oxygen? Times 0.21, 21% of 760. So the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level is about 160 millimeters of mercury, give or take. Is that what it would be here in Sheridan, Wyoming? No, because we're pretty high up in elevation. What we say about 88% of sea level stuff, right? So partial pressure of oxygen here is more like 140 millimeters of mercury. So when you go up high into the mountains and your high elevation tasks, which would normally be easy, get you huffing and puffing a lot, right? Harder breathing, you're breathing a lot heavier. People say, oh, well, it's because there's less oxygen up there. Not really, right? It's still 21% of the air. It's just a lower partial pressure of oxygen than there is at lower elevations. It's not driving itself into your bloodstream as strongly as it would be at a lower elevation where the atmosphere weighs more and is pushing into your body more. Gas exchange, this is diffusion, right? Simple diffusion. In diffusion, solutes move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Oxygen moves from the air into your bloodstream because there's a higher partial pressure in the air than there is in your bloodstream. High to low, just like always. But if you say go up in elevation, the difference between those two starts to shrink. And now it's not driven into your bloodstream as strongly. If you go up in elevation so high that the partial pressure falls below the partial pressure in your bloodstream, do you get any oxygenation at all? No, you don't. Interestingly enough, the cutoff in terms of elevation for that process is approximately the same height as the elevation of Mount Everest. So not only is it the highest mountain in the world, turns out it's just about the highest mountain a human could climb, period. Well, assuming you don't bring supplemental oxygen with you, which they mostly do anyway. But people have summited Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, and you can do that because it's just barely still higher than the partial pressure inside your body. If it got any lower, you wouldn't be able to. The first person to summit Mount Everest without bringing oxygen with them, before he was about to go, many people had tried, but they all wound up dead, right? So the first person to do it successfully before he set off on his journey, the reporter asked him, why are you going up there to die? He said, I'm not. I'm going up there to live. Which is a combination of cheesy and awesome. The awesome part only works because he actually didn't die, but everybody else who tried did. So anyway, probably just would have sounded stupid if he died.
Yeah, that would have been.
So partial pressure, the portion of atmospheric pressure represented by a single gas in proportion to how much of the air they make up. Let's see, let's go to this part here. It says there, alveoli contain more carbon dioxide and water vapor than atmospheric air. Let's look at this chart here. We've got the breakdown of the composition of air in two different places. Atmospheric air, that's all the air around us. Alveolar air, the air inside the respiratory zone of your lungs. And they are different, so let's see why. Again, you don't have to memorize these numbers, I'm just trying to illustrate a point. Okay? So, atmospheric air. Nitrogen, 78.6% of the air. Oxygen, 20.9%. Carbon dioxide, 0.04% of the air is carbon dioxide. Water vapor, 0.46% of the air is water vapor. Again, there can be slight variations in some of these things, like especially water vapor, depending on the climate you're in. Now look at the alveolar air. Nitrogen has gone from 78.6 to 74.9. Now, I can ask why. The easy answer would be, oh, well, it's gone into your bloodstream. But the thing is, we don't really use nitrogen, not inhaled nitrogen anyway. It is biologically more or less inert to us. So there would be nitrogen dissolved in your bloodstream, but there wouldn't really be a net movement of the gas because it's never really being used up in our body. So why does the percentage of nitrogen go down in inhaled air versus atmospheric air? Well, the answer is something we talked about with nasal breathing. What is one of the things let's see, you warm the air, you filter the air, and you humidify the air, which basically means adding more water vapor, right? About 12 times more, actually. And so you're literally watering down the composition of all of the rest of it. But nitrogen's not actually being used up. The two main gases that are biologically important here are oxygen and carbon dioxide. And look at how much they change. So about 21% of the air is oxygen in the air around us, and yet the air in your alveoli only 13.7% oxygen. That's because oxygen has moved into the blood. And this is all a passive process. This is all diffusion. So, like, well, why is there still oxygen left in there? It's because the two have equalized, met in the middle. You don't somehow actively pump the oxygen in your bloodstream. It's higher in the air than in the blood, and so they diffuse until the two are equal. So there's always still some oxygen left. Carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the air around us, and yet it's 5.2% of the air in the alveoli. Let me ask you something. You guys have heard of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, right? Or as it is part of CPR. So you're blowing this air into someone else to try and keep them alive. But is 13.7% oxygen enough oxygen for a person to use to stay alive? No, it's not. And 5.2% carbon dioxide is actually a toxic level of carbon dioxide. So how are we able to do that without killing these people even more?